I have never seen a woman in my life who would endure every species of fatigue and hardship from month to month and from year to year with that unflinching courage, zeal, and patience which she has ever done. For I know that which she has had to endure. She has been tossed upon the ocean of uncertainty. She has breasted the storms of persecution and buffeted the rage of men and devils, which would have borne down almost any other woman. Lucy Mack Smith. He carried the day, but I had to stay at home, as my father had been warned by the prophet to keep his daughter away from there because of the blacklegs and certain ones of questionable character who would attend there. His wife, Emma, had become the ruling spirit, and money had become her god. Helen Mar Kimball.
I am Ryan McKnight.
I'm Cara Santa Maria.
I am Christopher Smith.
Hi, I'm Andrew Torres.
This is Naked Mormonism,
the serial Mormon history podcast. The most well-regarded and renowned biography of Emma Hale Smith that exists to date is Mormon Enigma, written by Valine Avery and Linda Newell. When this book came out in 1984, it turned the realm of Mormon history, concerning Emma Smith, of course, on its head. Never before had scholars so unabashedly dealt with Emma's perspective of church history, especially when it came to polygamy, and never had it been conducted by women prior to this book. This was the 1980s in the field of Mormon history. Women were just beginning to gain a legitimate foothold in the field and being recognized for their contributions beyond just mere tokenism, you know. Now, the reason I bring up this book is for the title, Mormon Enigma, Emma Hale Smith. It's simply perfect. Emma is an enigma in the historical sense. Her first husband, Joseph Smith, is a phenomenon, but he's anything but enigmatic, right? He's hard to understand and nail down, but the documentation that exists about him is so extensive that multiple biographies have been written, all with slightly differing perspectives, to create a fairly holistic perspective of the guy. Emma, on the other hand, much more is left to mystery and speculation. What historians have about Emma from herself is just a few dozen letters to and from loved ones or prominent figures in the church, and then plenty of secondhand descriptions from those close to her. Unfortunately, Emma never kept a journal as far as historians are aware, and her scribe, Eliza R. Snow, had disagreements with Emma concerning polygamy, and therefore never provided scribal duties to Emma the way that William Clayton or Whiteout Willard Richards did for Joseph Smith. Somebody as enigmatic as Emma can be molded to fit many differing historical models. Was she the stone-faced pillar of support for Joe, as many claimed her to be? Or was she prone to flying off the handle in extreme situations? Was she kind, loving, and praiseworthy, or was she cold-hearted, shrew, and reclusive? Was her marriage to the prophet all sunshine and roses, or did they fight like rabid chimps, even including physical abuse? Did she fully participate in all the ordinances of the church at her own behest, or was she cajoled into them by Joe when he used those ordinances as bargaining chips just to get more wives? Did Emma try to kill Joseph Smith? Due to the simple lack of documentary evidence, quotes can be mined all day to create a version of Emma that fits into each one of these molds. What complicates matters further when trying to identify the historical Emma is the way she was slandered and perceived by the Salt Lake Church during and after her life following the Schism crisis. Emma and Joseph Smith III represented the single greatest threat to Bloody Brigham Young's claims to prophetic succession. He acted as one would expect somebody who had everything to lose would act, and the propaganda campaign that destroyed her character persists in Mormon culture to this day. Needless to say, as a result of all of these factors, a lot of lore has grown around Emma, much of it based on contemporary sources, yet exaggerated and amplified and sometimes even fabricated. With this in mind, we're going to attempt to discuss the supposed poisoning incident of Joseph Smith. In 1866, Bloody Brigham Young said this from the pulpit in Utah, quote, "The sympathies of the Latter-day Saints are with the family of the martyred prophet. I never saw a day in the world where I would not almost worship that woman, Emma Smith, if she would be a saint instead of being a devil. I feel so today. There is no good thing in a temporal point of view that I would withhold from her. Anything that is in my power to do for her, I would willingly do with all my heart and with an open hand. There are few here that knew Joseph Smith the prophet, and some of them are apostatizing from the work which the Lord commanded him to found, to run after young Joseph Smith, the second son of the prophet, who has no more authority to set himself up as a president and teacher of the people than any other man has in the sectarian world, who possess nothing of the priesthood of the Most High. Young Joseph Smith III does not possess one particle of this priesthood. The 12 apostles and other authorities of this church would have been exceeding glad if the prophet's family had come with us when we left Nauvoo for the valleys of these mountains, of Utah, of course. We would have made cradles for them if they had required them, and would have fed them on milk and honey. Emma is naturally a very smart woman. She is subtle and ingenious, and she has made all her children believe that myself, Brother Kimball, and the other members of the 12 laid the plot which terminated in the death of the prophet. This charge is especially laid to myself. Now, that is true, right? There were accusations that, some of which persist to this day in our LDS culture, that Emma claimed that Brigham Young orchestrated the assassination of Joseph Smith. And it's, considering the cultural and power struggle milieu from which the martyrdom arose, it's not crazy to conclude. He continues. At the time that Joseph was killed, I was in the city of Boston, a number of 100 miles away from the scene of the martyrdom. And that's always the go-to alibi, of course. She has made her children inherit lies. To my certain knowledge, Emma Smith is one of the damnedest liars I know of on this earth. Yet there is no good thing I would refuse to do for her if she would only be a righteous woman. But she will continue in her wickedness. Just continuing to assail the character of Emma Smith. He's very jealous, very guarded in his power struggle. Not 6 months before the death of Joseph, he called his wife Emma into a secret council, and there he told her the truth and called upon her to deny it if she could. He told her that the judgments of God would come upon her forthwith if she did not repent. He told her of the time she undertook to poison him, and he told her that she was a child of hell and literally the most wicked woman on this earth, that there was not one more wicked than she. He told her where she got the poison and how she put it in a cup of coffee. Said he, "You got that poison so and so, and I drank it, but you could not kill me." When it entered his stomach, he went to the door and threw it off. He spoke to her in that council in a very severe manner, and she said one word in reply. I have witnesses of this scene all around who can testify that I am now telling the truth. Twice she undertook to kill him. Joseph himself testified before high heaven more than once that she had administered poison to him. There are men and women present today who can bear witness that more hell was never wrapped up in any human being than there is in her. She gave him too heavy a dose, and he vomited it up and was saved by faith. End quote. Consider the context in which this sermon was given by bloody Brigham Young. The dude was always jealous and outspoken about his tenuous claims to the mantle of prophet. This was given in 1866, barely half a decade after Joseph III took the mantle of prophet of the reorganized church. In addition to that, Alexander Smith, Emma's second to youngest son, had just visited Utah Territory to poach people from the Brighamite church into the RLDS church. Now, Joe 3.0 may have been prophet, but Emma had a heavy hand in everything that happened in the church. She was the matriarch of the religion, of the RLDS religion, of course, and was treated with respect and reverence by the RLDS folk, which meant that she was treated with vitriol and vilification by Bloody Brigham. So that's the accusation from 22 years after Joe was assassinated, that Emma tried to poison him. But is there any contemporary source for Emma poisoning Joseph? Sort of. But it's not really clear cut. So Joe's journal from the 5th of November, 1843, this was contemporary, this was written at the time that it happened. It reads as follows, and we're going to parse out some possible interpretations after reading it. Quote, Sunday, November 5th, 1843, rode out with my mother and others for her health, was taken suddenly sick at the dinner table, went to the door and vomited all dinner, jaw dislocated and raised fresh blood. Every symptom of poisoning. Prayer meeting evening at the hall over the store. Joseph did not dress, nor Emma. End quote. Could this have been a poisoning? Him going to dinner and feeling like he was suddenly sick and vomiting, raising fresh blood, dislocating his jaw, and claiming every symptom of poison. Could this have been poisoning? It's plausible, but not very probable. So let's discuss why. And now, okay, so this discussion is about to go a little bit morbid for the next few minutes, but, please bear with me because this is all relevant. First, let's discuss this. Was there anybody close to Joseph Smith during that dinner who may have wanted him dead? Yes, absolutely. Joe had a lot of enemies in late 1843 Nauvoo, including Emma to some extent, really. I mean, it's not a matter of if somebody had motive, but who of many possible suspects was it that had access to his food or coffee without his notice? Well, Emma had plenty of motive to get rid of her husband with everything else that she was dealing with. Her feelings had shifted, her feelings about Joseph Smith, her husband, had shifted by mid-1842. She'd threatened divorce multiple times, and Joe considered that threat to have merit. She had plenty of Joe's property in her own name that she was going to be fine financially if he was removed. So there's really nothing that could have held her back from dosing him aside from love, right? Love of her husband, but love can be a double-edged sword in these matters. Now, a conversation about somebody poisoning Joseph Smith isn't complete without enumerating a few more possible suspects, right? It could have been Emma, but it could have been dozens of other people, right? The Laws, they were on their way from stalwart faithful members to hated enemies of the church at this time. We discussed William Law last episode. Joseph H. Jackson, he could have tried this, but, Joseph Jackson, he kind of strikes me as too dumb to try and pull off a poisoning. The Higbee brothers, who later became co-publishers of the Nauvoo Expositor, they suspected at this time that Joe had, poisoned their father. And Joe had just preached that funeral sermon only a month prior to when this happened in November of 1843. So the timing matches up. Maybe it was the Higbee brothers. John C. Reckitt Bennett, he certainly wanted Joe dead, but he didn't have access to Joe's food or drink at this time because he was mostly living in Missouri by late 1843. But Sidney Rigdon, he certainly wanted Joe gone long before late 1843, but Rigdon doesn't necessarily strike me as somebody who would be so subversive as poisoning Joe, in spite of his, warlike sermons during the Mormon War in Missouri 5 years prior. However, Rigdon did have a fairly solid claim to the throne once Joe died, so that's plenty motive in and of itself. Another half dozen other people had gone mysteriously missing or died under unexpected circumstances in Nauvoo, and they all had families, some of which certainly suspected foul play and wanted to retaliate against the powers that be, Joseph Smith. Add into this that there's the entire line of people who had some level of rightful claim to the throne beyond Hinchpin Sidney Rigdon, and the list of people who wanted Joe dead is nearly as long as his rap sheet of his crimes, right? Hell, Bloody Brigham himself is just as likely a suspect for poisoning Joseph Smith as Emma was. So the motives and the suspects are there for this to be a poisoning. But what about the substance and the symptoms? Now, the most likely potential substances for this poisoning are strychnine, cyanide, arsenic, or atropine. Now, each of them individually propose possibilities. Strychnine, that was often mixed with hard liquor and sold to the natives as firewater and made people go blind. However, the symptoms of strychnine poisoning don't match because strychnine causes seizure-like symptoms with spasms, back-arching, appendage rigidity, paranoia, stuff like that. However, it can cause a person's jaw to lock up, which Joe may have misconstrued as his jaw dislocating when he vomited. So that kind of fits the bill, right? But a dosage that would affect him so quickly, just in the amount of time that it took for him to eat dinner and then feel the symptoms, the amount required for that would have sent him into a coma in half an hour, which really doesn't fit with him going to the prayer meeting that same evening after he vomited up this blood. But what about cyanide? Cyanide is actually a better candidate than strychnine is. The onset of cyanide poisoning is immediate, and symptoms include violent vomiting, possibly even to the point of raising fresh blood, as Joe's journal states. But the other symptoms of cyanide poisoning don't seem to be there, because Joe didn't say anything about feeling otherwise ill with symptoms that might lead to cyanide poisoning, like chest pain, abdominal pain, paranoia, anxiety, skin rashes, stuff like that. But what about arsenic? arsenic is actually a really good candidate. Arsenic poisoning has widely been used as a poison since before the fall of the Western Roman Empire. In white powder form, arsenic is often referred to as inheritance powder because its frequent use to remove powerful people from their positions of power without any trace. Onset of arsenic poisoning takes about 30 minutes, and that fits into the timeline from when Joe ingested this poison, the candidate, to when he was out vomiting fresh blood. But, of course, headaches, confusion, diarrhea, excess saliva, sweating, convulsions, stomach cramps, and vomiting, those are all also symptoms of arsenic poisoning. And they usually send the target into convulsion and shock and then finally coma right before they die. So, basically, picture Joffrey Lannister without the whole bleeding eyes incident. That's what arsenic poisoning looks like. So if Joe had been hit with enough arsenic to cause him to vomit blood, he wouldn't be going to prayer meeting that same evening, right? But what about the final candidate, atropine? Atropine is distilled from the nightshade family. The berries of belladonna are juiced and then crystallized, which makes it water-soluble without any scent or trace. Now, belladonna was widely used as a medicine in herbal medical books of the day. Here's from a medical book by Jacob Bigelow, and he has it in his 1822 Materia Medica. This was published in Boston. And there's an entire section on belladonna, but this is what he says, quote, "The Atropa belladonna has bell-shaped flowers of a brownish or dusky color, yellow at base on the inside. The berries are of a dark purple color. The leaves have a nauseous and subacrid taste without smell. A peculiar alkali has been announced by M. Brandis as existing in this plant, and which he calls atropia. It is white, shining, crystallizable in needles, insipid, little soluble in water or alcohol, and capable of neutralizing a considerable quantity of acid to form salts. It is highly powerful, and even its vapor is injurious. The whole of the plant of belladonna is poisonous, producing in large doses intoxication, attended with thirst, nausea, insensibility of the retina, causing a dilated pupil, constriction of the throat, coma or delirium, convulsions, and other dangerous symptoms of narcotics. In fatal cases, the stomach and bowels are found inflamed and gangrenous, and the whole body becomes swollen and highly putrescent." End quote. Any of you who are familiar with the autopsy of Alvin Smith when he died in 1823, some of those symptoms may ring a bell. But belladonna, the atropine from which belladonna is, taken, belladonna is widely known to be a deliriant and a poison of the day, as were its cousin plants like datura and potatoes, right? That's the whole nightshade family. It was common knowledge that the entire nightshade family of plants, which includes like nearly 3,000 species, it contains nasty stuff that can get you really high or it can kill you. Bigelow's Materia Medica even says to dose carefully, beginning with, quote, "The commencing dose is a grain to be gradually increased till its effect on the stomach and head becomes perceptible by nausea and vertigo," end quote. So Joe vomiting his guts up, fits with atropine poisoning, right? But the thing is he didn't mention anything of vertigo or delirium or convulsions or anything else that might lead to conclude that this was actually atropine poisoning. But I would also postulate that Joe was quite well acquainted with the effects of vertigo and delirium that are attendant with nightshade poisoning long before 1843, and he would have known how to deal with them, probably not finding them notable enough to include those things in his journal entry for that day, especially if he was headed to prayer circle that night where other deleterious substances may have been present. Still, enough atropine causes an immediate fit of vomiting, likely would have sent Joe to bed with visions of angels dancing on pinheads for the night, but that didn't happen. At least that's not what the historical record reveals. So atropine poisoning isn't a perfect fit. Besides, anybody with a passing knowledge of botanical medicine, of which there were plenty in leading roles in Nauvoo Mormonism, had the expertise to distill and crystallize the stuff. So there was plenty of access to chemicals like this that could have been the agents of the poisoning. But my point is, there were plenty of candidate poisons that Joe could have been hit with. There were also plenty of people who wanted him dead, both enemies of the church and perceived friends who actually had access to his food or his coffee when his head was turned. So all three criteria of means, motive, and opportunity are present for this to be a poisoning with intent to kill. So it's completely and totally plausible. Now the question is, how probable is it that Joe was poisoned, whether by Emma or by any of the other dozens of people who wanted him dead? Well, the probability increases with each and every person added to the list who wanted him dead and had access to him. Remember, we're only 6 months out from when he was actually assassinating. So judging the probability simply requires introducing other plausible conclusions. So now that my search history has the NSA following me, right, Carrie? What about other less salacious explanations? What else could have caused Joseph Smith to vomit so violently after taking in food to the point that he turned up blood and dislocated his jaw? Well, food poisoning, right? Food poisoning is a great explanation for this. Food thermometers weren't a thing, and undercooked pork or chicken, that was a common affliction in 19th century America, right? This whole episode easily could have been caused by an immediate bout after eating some food that was poisoned, or it was undercooked or whatever, right? Not deliberately poisoned, right? He may have had some undercooked bacon for breakfast, and then the sickness hit him during this lunch when he thought that he was poisoned. Violent vomiting along with diarrhea, that sure fit his journal entry once he got it out of his system, and then he could have been well enough to attend prayer meeting that night. What about a medical explanation? Well, it turns out that Joe was under a lot of stress at this time in his life, and he also had a lot of partners that he was physically active with. The bacterium that causes peptic ulcers can be transferred orally through just a loving kiss shared by one of his dozens of wives, and of course the stress of running a city, running a church, guarding against assassins from within and without high church ranks, being wanted by 2 different states, among many, many, many other pressures. Those things, that amount of stress could have lowered his immune system's resilience. So, he gets an ulcer from all of it, then he pukes up blood after eating some spicy food, right? That's a completely reasonable explanation for what happened here. So, myriad explanations have been explored to remove any probability of Emma actually poisoning Joseph Smith, as Bloody Brigham Young contends here. Now, Linda King Newell, one of the authors of Mormon Enigma, she wrote a dialogue article in 1989 titled The Emma Smith Lore Reconsidered, in which she attempts to dispel some myths that have grown around Emma as a result of the anti-Emma, anti-RLDS propaganda from the Brighamite Church. So here's Linda King Newell's take on the situation. Quote, Joseph would subsequently experience periodic bouts of sudden nausea and vomiting. Many ailments could cause such symptoms, including acute indigestion, food poisoning, ulcers, gallstones, but only poisoning, bleeding ulcers, or rarely food poisoning would have led to such an acute episode. Moreover, the 1844 poison strong enough to cause hemorrhaging in the stomach as rapidly after ingestion, as Joseph's diary indicates, would not leave the victim well enough to attend a meeting just a few hours later. According to Joseph's diary, quote, domestic concerns, end quote, kept him busy the next morning. Perhaps Emma was able to convince her husband that she had not attempted to poison him. The previous evening, according to Brigham, Emma had cried when Joseph lashed out at her. Tears, rather than an open defense, are in keeping with at least one other occasion when she endured a public rebuke from Joseph. When Joseph was suffering from violent vomiting the next month, he reported that Emma, quote, waited on me, assisted by my scribe, Willard Richards, and his brother Levi, who administered some herbs and mild drinks. I was never prostrated so low in so short a time before, by evening was considerably better, end quote. So, Valine Avery, the other author of Mormon Enigma, also interviewed 2 physicians at the time that they were writing Mormon Enigma who said that they couldn't diagnose a patient who had been dead for 140 years at the time, but that Joe's symptoms are most consistent with ulcers, quote, considering Joseph's stress during this period, end quote. So, all of this leads to the big question, right? Did Emma Smith try to poison Joseph Smith? We can't know for sure. Some of his symptoms are consistent with poisoning, but can be better explained medically without the need for poison. But is the fact of whether or not he was actually poisoned by Emma what really matters here? Does it actually matter if Emma really put the inheritance powder in his coffee? At face value, these seem like the big questions, right? But I think there's a more important discussion at the root of this conversation. So it may be helpful to reframe the question. What set of circumstances would have led to Joseph Smith suspecting his own beloved first wife to have poisoned him? The loving Emma, who's been by his side through thick and thin for nearly 17 years by this point, trying to kill her husband? I don't think any rational person could conclude that Emma was happy in her marriage by late 1843. If that was the case, what was her exit strategy? The truth is, Emma and every other woman in antebellum America didn't have much control over their own lives. If they found themselves in a situation that made them miserable, which many could argue Emma was miserable at this time, there wasn't much that they could do without serious and unpleasant consequences for themselves. Being a divorced mother in America today holds a stigma, and society has come a long way since the 1840s. During this Nauvoo period, a woman couldn't legally sign contracts. She could be gainfully employed, but women made so little compared to men that it was hard to provide for children. Legally speaking, divorce put children into the custody of the husband. Children always had to have a male guardian. That meant if Emma divorced Joseph Smith, her children, Julia, aged 13, Joseph III, aged 11, Frederick G. William Smith, aged 8, and Alexander, aged 5, they would all be given to Joseph Smith by the state. See, that presents a problem, right? Because not only did Emma want out of the situation herself, but she wanted her children to be safe from this criminal kingpin. So if she filed for divorce, that would take away any legal ability that she might have to give them a better life. That would put them all in the custody of Joseph Smith. So divorce really was out of the question because of the consequences that it brought, even though she threatened it many times to Joseph Smith. Now, another option she had would be to run away. Just run away, get away from Nauvoo. But the thing is, Joe had friends who would bring her and the kids back. They wouldn't get out of the state of Illinois before his boys found her. And then how would Joe punish her for trying to leave? Right? I mean, he had total control over her, and such insubordination would threaten his power. She wouldn't be treated well. Emma was Skylar White, right? She had no way out and nowhere to turn. Every person in Nauvoo that she might turn to for some kind of help was under Joe's control or one of his spies. Emma was an island. She was forced into this situation. So the final option would be to have Joe removed, have him killed. If he died, the children would legally be given to one of his brothers. That'd be Samuel Smith, Hiram Smith, or Crazy Willie Smith. But Emma could also likely make quite an argument that her surviving older brother, Alva, should be the custodian of the children, and the state may very well grant that to her. She could move back to Pennsylvania, continue to raise her children, find another nice man to wed so that she could legally be the guardian of her own children again, and then life would go on. What that means is, out of all of these options, then Emma presents this predicament that she was in. Joseph Smith dying was the best possible option for Emma to get her and her kids out of this dangerous situation. At the end of the day, Joseph Smith probably had stomach ulcers, but the fact that a reasonable person could conclude that Emma poisoned her own husband means the situation was so far beyond salvageable or reasonable for her, and that she had no options. The Overton window of her life and the possible decisions that she could make have been dragged so far in the direction of insane by Joseph Smith that poisoning him was actually a reasonable option. And beyond that, once he died, she was poised in a financial situation that she could feed the kids for years, even if Joe's income from the church suddenly dried up. However, Emma wasn't completely powerless. She was still the elect lady of Mormonism. She still held sway in the Relief Society. She watched out for the welfare of polygamous wives and other women in Nauvoo, especially her fellow elite women, right? Even in the home, she held a certain amount of power, even if Joe only begrudgingly ceded ground in order to grant her that power. An interesting case where this kind of power dynamic between Emma and Joe is revealed has to do with the Nauvoo Mansion and the bar that Joe kept on the ground floor. Now, this bar, of course, it was for entertaining dignitaries and visitors, as well as his closest friends who could bend the word of wisdom rules at their leisure, right? But when it became too rowdy one evening in early 1844, Emma requested Joe to close the bar, which he did in order to keep the peace. So Emma did have some level of power, right? There were, but it's kind of reasonable too, because there were enough grog shops for the Mormons and visitors to satisfy their alcohol palate. So the bar was removed and Emma could no longer bother Joe with incessant requests to have it taken out. So he did cede that ground. So she did hold some sway. But the bar in the Nauvoo Mansion is kind of interesting, and there's kind of a lot that happened around this bar. The Smith family had moved into the Nauvoo Mansion around August of 1843. Now, there's some evidence to indicate that they were living there part-time as early as March of 43, but it isn't included in Joe's journal that they actually moved into the Nauvoo Mansion until early August. One of the first installations into this completed home was this bar, because it was said to be the Nauvoo Marriott, with all of the amenities expected of any nice hotel in any major city across the country. The Nauvoo Mansion continued as a successful hotel business for the months of September through December, with the bar intact. Christmas Day festivities eventually brought together a large gathering of friends and family, and this is all recounted in the history of the church. Now, I'm going to read a fairly extensive passage, but it's important, from the 2015 Dan Vogel edition of the History of the Church, where it begins telling about some, inconsiderate Christmas carolers who just showed up on the doorstep of the Nauvoo Mansion at 1 o'clock in the morning. But the lovely Christmas festivities that continued that day after these carolers showed up are interrupted by a brawl at the Nauvoo Mansion bar with a faceless drunkard in the late evening. Quote, Monday, December 25th. This morning, about 1 o'clock, I was aroused by an English sister, Lettice Rushton, widow of Richard Rushton, Sr., who 10 years ago lost her sight, accompanied by 3 of her sons with their wives, and her 2 daughters with their husbands, and several of her neighbors singing, Mortals, awake, and angels join, etc., which caused a thrill of pleasure to run through my soul. All of my family and boarders arose to hear the serenade, and I felt to thank my heavenly Father for their visit, and blessed them in the name of the Lord. They also visited my brother Hiram, who was awakened from his sleep at 1 o'clock in the morning. Christmas carolers. So inconsiderate. He arose and went out of doors. He shook hands with and blessed each one of them in the name of the Lord, and said that he thought at first that a cohort of angels had come to visit him. It was such heavenly music to him. Now the rest of the day. At home all day, about noon gave counsel to some brethren who called on me from the Morley settlement, and told them to keep law on their side, and they would come out well enough. Which ended up being hollow words to those people whose homes would be on fire less than 2 years in the future. About 2 o'clock in the afternoon, about 50 couples sat down at my table to dine. While I was eating, my scribe called, requesting me to solemnize the marriage of his brother, Dr. Levi Richards, and Sarah Griffiths, but as I could not leave, I referred him to President Brigham Young, who married them. A large party supped at my house, and spent the evening in music, dancing, etc., in a most cheerful and friendly manner. During the festivities, a man, with his hair long and falling over his shoulders and apparently drunk, came in and acted like a Missourian. I requested the captain of the police to put him out of doors. A scuffle ensued, and I had an opportunity to look him full in the face, when, to my great surprise and joy untold, I discovered it was my long-tried, warm, but cruelly persecuted friend, Orrin Porter Rockwell, just arrived from nearly a year's imprisonment without conviction in Missouri. End quote. So pistol-packing Porter Rockwell decided to crash the Christmas party at the Nauvoo Mansion. As soon as Joe realized who this long-haired drunkard was, he was elated to see his childhood friend here in Nauvoo instead of continuing to languish in a Missouri prison where he had spent nearly a year. Why was he in a Missouri jail? Well, Pistolpack and Porter Rockwell was the primary suspect in the assassination attempt of former Governor Lilburn W. Boggs. You can go back to episode 109 where we discussed the documentation that links Porter Rockwell with this assassination attempt. Then Port went into hiding for about 9 months to keep from arrest and extradition to face the broken Missouri legal system. All the while, this is all happening in 1842, the Bennett meltdown transpired as Reckitt Bennett published articles about Joe and the Mormons while he was collecting affidavits from the citizens of Nauvoo. During this time, Porter Rockwell confronted Reckitt Bennett in that same episode 109 to try and get Bennett to stop publishing his accusations that Joe had sent Port to Missouri in order to kill Lilburn Boggs. After hiding out for those 9 months, Port finally let his guard down in episode 142 and was unexpectedly arrested as he attempted to board a ferry to Nauvoo. And since early 1843, he's been caught up in the cogs of the Missouri legal system. Joe had sent Joseph H. Jackson to break Porter Rockwell out of prison in spring of 1843, but the mission wasn't successful. Now, Pistolpack and Porter Rockwell was somehow here in Nauvoo, drunk, smelly, unkempt, with long hair, and looking for a brawl if anybody steps between him and the bar at the Nauvoo Mansion. But how did he get here? What happened? Well, because the Mormons were and still are incessant record keepers, after the party started back up and Port had a few more in him, then slept off the hangover, he was put down in front of a scribe to tell his story. And he tells about how he was arrested in St. Louis as he was boarding a ferry to take him to Nauvoo. Then he was put into jail for 2 days with iron hobbles around his ankles. And then during the journey from St. Louis to Jefferson City, there was a guy behind Porter in the stagecoach who was like being annoying and poking him in the back with something. And then when Port reacted to him saying, "That's not very gentlemanly of you," the man's wife apparently whispered something into his ear, probably telling him that, the guy he was bothering was the guy who shot Lilburn Boggs, and then the man immediately ceased his operations. Apparently, during this trip, the coach driver was so drunk that he ran them into a tree and then into a ditch. So Pistolpack and Port eventually took over piloting the stagecoach for him. And then he tells about their arrival to Independence, where a preliminary hearing was held to ascertain whether or not the state had enough evidence to move forward with a case against Porter Rockwell. He was committed to the Independence jail for safekeeping because the judge expected a mob to form and lynch old Port. Now here in Independence, Pistolpack and Port tried his first escape attempt when a guy was committed to the same cell with his saddlebags in tow. Now, this is all from Porter Rockwell himself, quote, "The saddlebags contained some fire steels, gunflints, and articles of Indian trade. I sawed the irons nearly off with one of the fire steels. He got the Negro girl to help him with a knife, and I finished cutting the fetters with it. He would frequently call for a good supper and pay for it, which was allowed him, but not allowed me. He was very anxious to escape, and urged me to undertake it with him. He ordered a good supper, and he ate very hearty. I would not eat, telling him that he could not run if he ate so much. Nearly dusk, as the jailer came in to get the dishes, we sprang to the door, and I locked him in and threw the key into the garden. In coming downstairs, we met the jailer's wife. I told her that her husband was unharmed. I had only locked him up. We had a board fence to climb over, which was about 12 feet high. I climbed it and ran about 20 rods when he called to me to come back and help him over, which I did. If I had not, I should have escaped. The pure air had so great an effect upon me that I gave out and slacked my pace. The populace of the place came up, and I told them to run. They would soon catch him, and that I had given out and could not run. They soon returned with him. I fell into the crowd and walked back to the jail yard. Sheriff Joseph H. Reynolds laid his hand upon my shoulder. He, being the first to approach me, asked me where the key was. I told him, in the garden." End quote. So Port's escaped attempt failed. Unfortunately, the excited crowd that gathered knew who he was. He was public enemy number one. This is the guy who tried to kill their hero, Lilburn Boggs. This is the same Boggs who got rid of the Mormon problem, and these people loved Lilburn Boggs for it. So now a guy named Smallwood Nolan was the first guy in the crowd to call for a lynching of Porter Rockwell because he had escaped from prison. Now, the same sheriff who would arrest Joseph Smith in June of 1843, Sheriff Joseph H. Reynolds, he saw the crowd's excitement here. He was the guy who was handling all of the extradition and everything, dealing with Joseph Smith and with Porter Rockwell here. So when he saw the crowd's excitement, he decided to act. Quote, "When Reynolds gave me a push towards the crowd and said, 'There he is, God damn him, do what you damn well please with him,' Nolan's son-in-law, by marrying one of his mulatto wenches, a Mexican, stepped up to me and lay hold of me. When I told him to stand off or I would mash his face, he stepped back." End quote. Now, the people knew that Porter he wasn't going to go to the gallows without a fight. So Sheriff Reynolds eventually took him to the upstairs of the jail and asked for the tool that Port used in order to cut off his ankle irons. The angry mob followed him up the stairs and then filled the small jail room. It was time for a public lynching. Not only a public lynching, but public lynching of a pariah of Missouri. Quote, "I went to the saddlebags and handed him the knife and fire steel. While feeling for them, I got hold of a piece of buckskin that had 3 or 4 pounds of bullets tied up in it, which I intended to use in mashing in the head of anyone that should attempt to put a rope on my neck. A rope was passed along over the heads of the people into the room to a bald-headed man. About this time, pistols could be heard cocking in every part of the room, and bowie knives were produced as if for a fight." End quote. And then it sort of just ends. I don't know what happened here, but whatever transpired in this tense situation with the mob on one end of the room and Porter Rockwell with a rucksack of buckshot ready to swing at anybody, it all just seems to have died down. He claims that the crowd just slowly dispersed. Now, I would be willing to bet that Sheriff Reynolds stepped forward and said that, Porter Rockwell, he's a prisoner and he's in the custody of the state of Missouri and he's going to have a fair trial before we put him to the gallows. In an attempt to disperse the mob. It's a drunken, angry mob. They wanted to kill this guy. They wanted to lynch him. But the thing is, Sheriff Reynolds was an avowed enemy of the Mormons, and I wouldn't expect Port or any other Mormon scribes to include a favorable thing coming from him in the historical record. But eventually, how it all played out, the historical record doesn't tell us, but Port somehow evaded a mob lynching that night. But Sheriff Reynolds wasn't messing around anymore, so he ended up hobbling Port by locking his right arm to his left ankle and then left him like that for a month before his next trial. And he said that when he was finally released from this hobbling, he could barely stand up straight. Now, the next trial was hearing the criminal suit against him for breaking out of prison. When asked if Port had any legal counsel by the judge, he selected Alexander Donovan. Now, Donovan was a longtime friend of the Mormons. He had represented Joe and the other Mormon elites in their November 1838 court of inquiry in the wake of the Missouri Mormon War. So Donovan had Porter Rockwell transferred to Liberty Jail, which was close to Donovan's home and made it a lot easier for Donovan to actually meet with Port periodically through his forthcoming legal troubles. So Port spent about 10 days in Liberty Jail, which was more accommodating than every other jail that he had been in before, although, it was still horrible because it was a jail in the 19th century in America, right? But it wasn't long-lived, this Liberty Jail stay, because after 10 days, he was remanded back to the Independence Jail for his hearing. Port spent the next 2 months in the Independence Jail. This was spring of 1843. Sheriff Reynolds paid pistol-packing Porter Rockwell a little visit in the jail to gloat about the new set of documents that he had in his hand that would get Joe legally arrested and extradited to Missouri. This was late June of 1843, and Reynolds was about to leave for Nauvoo to arrest Joseph Smith. He thought, maybe he could get Port to do his dirty work for him with a little offer in exchange for Port's freedom. This is how Porter Rockwell reports it. Quote, "During this time, Sheriff Joseph H. Reynolds told me he was going to arrest Joseph Smith, and they had received letters from Nauvoo which satisfied them that Joseph Smith had unlimited confidence in me, that I was capable of tolling him in a carriage or on horseback anywhere that I pleased, and if I would only toll him out by riding or any other way so that they could apprehend him, I might please myself whether I stayed in Illinois or came back to Missouri. They would protect me, and any any plot of land that I would name, the citizens of Jackson County would donate, club together and raise, and that I should never suffer for want afterwards." quote, "You only deliver Joe Smith into our hands and name your pile," end quote. I replied, "I will see you all damned first, and then I won't," end quote. It was a deal. You give us Joseph Smith, you get your freedom. Not only that, the citizens of the town will give you any plot of land that you request. But of course, Port wouldn't sell out his childhood friend and his religious and his military leader, but Sheriff Reynolds was actually a smart guy to give this a try, right? Joe trusted very few people with his life, but Orrin Porter Rockwell was one of them. So if Sheriff Reynolds could just get Port to take Joe to the right place at the right time, it would make his job of extraditing Joe to Missouri a lot easier. But understandably, Pistol Packin' Port was loyal and he refused to sell out his friend. But the feelings of powerlessness and inevitability overcame him. Luckily, Porter's feelings were allayed when he saw a sign that he interpreted as divine. This is from his own mouth. Quote, "About the time that Joseph was arrested by Reynolds at Dixon, I, knowing that they were after him and no means under heaven of giving him any information, my anxiety became so intense upon the subject, knowing their determination to kill him, that my flesh twitched on my bones. I could not help it, twitch it would. While undergoing this sensation, I heard a dove light on the window in the upper room of the jail and commence cooing, and then went off. In a short time, he came back to the window where a pane was broken. He crept through between the bars of iron, which were about 2.5 inches apart. I saw it fly round the trap door several times, but it did not alight, but continued cooing until it crept through the bars again and flew out through the broken window. I relate this, as it was the only occurrence of the kind that happened during my long and weary imprisonment. But it proved a comfort to me. The twitching of my flesh ceased, and I was fully satisfied from that moment that they would not get Joseph into Missouri, and that I should regain my freedom. From the best estimates that can be made, it was at the time when Joseph was in the custody of Reynolds. And a few days afterwards, Sheriff Reynolds came into the jail and told me that he had made a failure in the arrest of Joseph Smith." End quote. Luckily for Port, his anxiety was satisfied when he saw a dove fly around. But he wasn't out of the woods yet, because he continued to languish for another 2 months in the Independence Jail, when he was then conveyed back to Liberty Jail. Now, while he was in Liberty Jail again, he received a very kind visit from his mother, who gave him $100 so that he could pay Alexander Doniphan's legal fees. In Liberty, Port once again attempted his next escape. Which is interesting because this was not the first Mormon to try and break out of Liberty Jail. But instead of trying to dig through the walls like Joseph Smith and the other 5 members, the 5 elites who were arrested and confined there in 1838 to 39, Port instead decided to remove the smokestack and from the potbelly stove in the dungeon and attempted to crawl through the exhaust hole of the smokestack. Unfortunately for him, though, he could barely fit through the hole to the main floor, but he couldn't break out of the door. So he just ended up giving up on this escape attempt and just laid down on the floor of the main story of the jail and waited for the jailers to find him there the next morning. They did find him, and he said, quote, "It caused quite an excitement," end quote. But finally, Port's last trial was scheduled for 2 weeks in the future from when he made this second escape attempt. Somebody appeared in the night, and unfortunately he doesn't tell us who it is, but apparently they offered him freedom in exchange for something. But he's not very clear on what the details of this are. But Port decided it best to stick it out for the 2 weeks and go to trial instead of trying to escape jail and then continuing to have the state of Missouri on his tail. Right? And this was a good decision, right? Because if he were to escape prison, Missouri would still be chasing after him. But if he could just get a ruling in his favor and be released, he wouldn't have to worry about this anymore. And he could come and visit his family in Missouri. Yeah, but he still had to stand trial for trying to break out of prison because the state didn't have any evidence that he pulled the trigger on Boggs back in May of the previous year. You see, all that the state had on Porter Rockwell was the affidavit that Boggs signed that pointed the finger at Port and Joe. But the thing is, Boggs didn't see the assassin. Lilburn Boggs was just sitting in his study, and then bullets crashed through the window unexpectedly. He was struck in the head and the neck and, incapacitated, rendered unconscious by the buckshot, and he never saw who was on the other side of the window who actually pulled the trigger. So there was no hard evidence connecting Port to the assassination attempt, and Port knew that. His legal counsel, Alexander Donovan knew that. The state prosecutor knew that the state didn't have proof, so he was best to just deal with being in jail for another 2 weeks and just see it out. So finally, his trial came, and this is how Pistol Packin' Port tells the story. Quote, "The trial came according to my last notification. I was tried for breaking Independence Jail, and although the law of Missouri reads that in order to break jail, a man must break a lock, a door, or a wall, still Judge King ruled that it was breaking jail to walk out when the door is open, and under this ruling, the jury brought a verdict of 5 minutes imprisonment in the county jail. But I was kept there for 4 or 5 hours, during which time several attempts were made to get up some other charge against me." End quote. So why did the court find that 5 minutes of jail time was a fitting punishment for trying to break out of jail? Why, basically, they just let him go. Why did the state and the jury decide to just let Port go? The answer is simple: mob law. Orrin Porter Rockwell was public enemy number 1 of Missouri, and he was in state custody. That meant once he was released, he had a journey of a few hundred miles before he reached the safety of Illinois, and the people knew it. He'd have to travel home upon his release, which provided plenty of opportunity for the mob to catch up and to have their way with him. Sure, Port wasn't found guilty because the state didn't have any hard evidence that he pulled the trigger, right? But the court of public opinion had ruled the death sentence for Port a year and a half ago. They'd certainly enforced their own ruling as soon as he was out of state custody and on his own. Now, this sentiment, this understanding of how mob law works, was not lost on Port or on his legal counsel, Alexander Donovan. Quote, "About 8 p.m. on December 13th, General Donovan took me out and told me I must take across the country on foot and not walk on any traveled road unless it was during the night, as they would be apt to follow and again take me, as they did not care on what grounds, so they could make me trouble. I accordingly started, accompanied by my mother, and went to the house of a widow, where I obtained my first supper in freedom for more than 9 months. We then traveled 2 miles and obtained $4. I then took through the woods to the road, where I heard 2 men riding on horseback. I hid behind a shady tree, and overheard one of them say, 'He's not gone many minutes. We shall soon overtake him.' I went round the houses and traveled in the fields by the side of the road. The moon was in its first quarter, and I traveled during the night about 25 miles. I carried a little food with me, and the next day traveled on the road and walked past Crooked River, the Battle of Crooked River, to a Mr. Taylor's with all the skin off my feet." End quote. Port continued his journey after his release. He traveled largely by night and never on well-traveled roads. He stayed with some nice people. He gave them 50 cents here and there for boarding him for the night or for providing him with food or whatever. And then a nice man even provided Port with some whiskey for one of his nights. He occasionally hired drivers and people with horses just to carry him some distance, which he says, quote, "was a very great relief on my weary feet," end quote. And he also popped in to Haun's Mill to pay his respects to his fallen brothers in the Covenant. After 2 weeks of walking and riding back roads towards Nauvoo, his journey through hostile territory finally came to its end. Quote, "I then continued my journey about 30 miles, where I rested 3 days to recruit my feet. I was then carried 25 miles on horseback and walked the same day 25 more miles. The day following, I walked 40 miles, and then waited another day and engaged a man to carry me to Montrose, to which place I was 3 days in going. I immediately crossed the river to Nauvoo in a small boat and came straight to the mansion." End quote. What a glorious reunion on Christmas Day this was. Joe's primary enforcer was now free from the Missouri mobocrats. He'd spent a year and a half away from the kingdom on the Mississippi, over 9 months in various jails all over Mississippi, facing trials, attempting to escape, evading lynch mobs against all odds, and now pistol-packing Porter Rockwell made his triumphant return to the kingdom on the Mississippi. He was unkempt, he was dirty, he was undernourished, he had long hair. While what we read, all of his recounting of it, that was recorded the day after Port's return to Nauvoo. He was the center of the Christmas party when his return was discovered. After he was drunkenly brawling with some people and Joe realized who it was, the party quieted down and restarted, and everybody decided to sit around and see what was going on with Porter Rockwell. So he recounted the above story to everybody in attendance while, of course, the drinks were flowing freely from the bar that was in the Nauvoo Mansion that Emma was begrudgingly allowing Joseph Smith to keep there for a little while longer. When Porter Rockwell concluded his regaling everybody of these stories, Joseph Smith pronounced a prophecy that has become iconic when discussing Pistol Pack and Porter Rockwell in Mormon history. And it's one of Joe's few prophecies that actually came true in spite of all odds. Quote, I prophesy in the name of the Lord that you, Orrin Porter Rockwell, so long as ye shall remain loyal and true to thy faith, need fear no enemy. Cut not thy hair, and no bullet or blade can harm thee. End quote. The exact wording of this prophecy was never recorded in any official church publication, but Port carried those words with him to his grave in Utah decades later and frequently told friends and family of the prophecy that was placed upon his head. This turned Pistol Pack and Porter into the Samson of Mormonism. He went through the rest of his life dealing with many altercations, dozens of assassinations, frequent battles with Native Americans, and he was never shot or stabbed his entire life after this prophecy was given. He died an old man in 1878, an outlaw, a bastard with a bloody life behind him. He only cut his hair once before his death in order to make a wig for Agnes Coolbrith Smith, widow of Don Carlos and of Joseph Smith. What that means is Porter Rockwell was back in town. Now, if anybody, Emma or anybody else, tried to poison or harm the prophet in any way, shape, or form, they would once again fear a midnight visit from the destroying angel of Mormonism. And that's going to do it for our episode today. We have Sunstone coming up, everybody. Have you ever heard of Sunstone? Do you know what it's about? You heard me talk about it on the show before? Well, it's coming around again. July 31st through August 3rd in Salt Lake City at the Mountain America Expo Center is going to be the annual Big Party Sunstone Symposium. What is Sunstone? It is the premier Mormon con. All things Mormon history, Mormon ethnography, as well as all sorts of cool little Mormon trinkets and fun things that you can find there at various little vendors that are there in the main hall. Last year when I was there, I got a seer stone from a good friend of mine, Mark Elwood, and you can even get your hair braided by some fundamentalist Mormons. You can you find all sorts of really good books from the retailers who sell and specialize in Mormon books, and even maybe, hawk one of your old Mormon books to one of the retailers that, deal in old school books like Benchmark. Benchmark usually has a table there. Needless to say, Sunstone is the ultimate Mormon con. It's coming up. It's a great time. Pick up your tickets, sunstonemagazine.com if you're in the Salt Lake City area, or if you're able to travel to the Salt Lake City area. Maybe this isn't getting to you too late and you can still plan for it. And for anyone who is going or is planning on attending, I really hope to see you there. Hope to hang out with you and spend some time going to various sessions with you and, just meeting you, shaking your hand, and getting to know who actually listens to my voice every week and is on the other end of these headphones. So with that, we also have a few new patrons to thank over at patreon.com/nakedmormonism. We have a new pledge from Laura, a new pledge from Chris, and a new patron, Stephanie, with a very remarkable last name that leads me to believe that Stephanie came from Short Creek. So to all of our new patrons, thank you so much for pledging to support the show with your hard-earned money. It really goes a long way in helping to fund the research that goes into this, as well as getting me to these various conferences all over the country, like Sunstone, like MHA a couple months ago, like John Wimmer Historical Association, that's coming up in September in New York. There will be more details coming on that in future episodes after I'm done plugging Sunstone and have gone to that. So that is going to do it for today for our main segment. I did have a little bit of listener mail to get to, and this comes in the form of an email from a listener named Carrie Weinheimer. And Carrie just sent an email, very kind about pledging to support the show on patreon.com/nakedmormonism. One more plug on that. And Carrie also said some interesting details here that I just want to share with all of you and why I find this remarkable. And let me read Carrie's email first, and then I'll tell you why I find it remarkable. Carrie says, my story, I left the church before you were born. Born 1962, a family of 11, left church at 24 while at BYU after mission in Japan. I can't imagine what it was like to leave the church while you're at BYU in the 1980s. I can't imagine what that was like. The intelligent students in Japan converted me instead of vice versa. That secular nation over there, that condemned nation of Japan. I find that interesting. Recently retired from a career at the NSA as a computer scientist and statistician and started listening to many podcasts, including your own. And it says, now Carrie is living in the middle of nowhere in Maine. Spend my afternoons in my sacred grove listening to one of your podcasts, smoking suburb, and drinking a strong-grained drink. Damn word of wisdom. And then he goes on to, pay homage to the show, which I really appreciate. And then he signs it, Carrie, why the fuck did I work for the Department of Defense for over 30 years, Weinheimer? And then the PS and the PSS are what I would like to discuss here. It says, feel free to publicize everything and don't worry about the NSA listening on. They're about as competent as the LDS Church. And that is something that my little conspiracy theory brain just short-circuited that. So thank you for that, Carrie. And then the PSS. Oh yeah, I'd be interested in a podcast comparing the new fad of ASMR to the Mormon concept of feeling the spirit. And then in parentheses, I hadn't felt the spirit for 40 years until I recently started listening to ASMR videos. And then that's the end of Carrie's email, and we shared some more correspondence back and forth. Carrie also sent in a very generous one-time donation, for which I want to dearly thank him. And I hope eventually he gets to this episode in the backlog. It sounds like he's quite a ways back now in the backlog, going through the Mormon History Tour back in 2017. So when you get here, Carrie, let me know. Shoot me another email. I'd love to talk to you again. Anyway, so what I want to discuss about Carrie's email, ASMR, is that something that rings a bell to any of you? Have any of you watched or listened to ASMR videos or audio? It's just something that you have to have the right voice. You have to have the right combination of sounds in order for ASMR to be invoked. But when it works, when it's perfect, when there's a perfect ASMR, cacophony of sounds and feelings, then it does. It very much makes you feel the spirit. And there are some people who can't feel ASMR, but there are some of those out there who love it. And that's their spiritual pursuit, is listening to ASMR videos. And likewise, Carrie, and I'm going to put this out to all of the listeners, if anyone knows of a podcast or of a study that's been done in comparing ASMR to the burning in the bosom, I'd be very interested in that as well. Because the first time, when I was growing up in the church, I felt the spirit, or at least what I called the spirit. But now I have those same spiritual experiences when I listen to particularly good metal songs, right? So I would be very interested in if there has been a comparison done possibly of a Mormon or a post-Mormon group or study or podcasters who have compared physiological reactions to ASMR videos. as opposed to the burning in the bosom. It'd be very, very interesting. So if that does come to mind, send me an email, nakedmormonism@gmail.com. I'd love to hear from you, and I'd love to share that on the podcast if something does come in, if that's ever been done. And if not, and if you do a podcast that might fit in, do it. I think that'd be a really interesting subject to explore and study. The final point that I want to just make about Carrie's email here is, born in 1962, right? This guy's in his, late 50s, mid to late 50s, and he's listening to the podcast. He's left the church. He left the church in his mid 20s and is now listening to the podcast. And it sounds like he's learning quite a bit about church history that he didn't know, as was the case when I started doing the podcast. But that is very heartening to me, because that shows me that it's not just millennials who are leaving the church. It's not just people who are in the younger generations who have instant access to Google who are, that are creating the influx of leaving, not the influx, but the deluge of people leaving the church, that it does indeed transcend all age and demographies, that people of all ages, of all social statuses, they are learning that there is history out there and there are aspects of the church that just simply aren't true and that they are leaving. And Carrie just provides an interesting and a wonderful example of that. And then, of course, used to work for the NSA, now works, is now retired. They're about as competent as the LDS Church. So I feel like I can rest assured, based on the content of at least this episode alone, that I'm probably being spied on by both of them. And that makes me happy. So but of course, that's going to do it for our episode today. Once again, thank you, Carrie, and for all of the listeners who send in listener feedback on the email, on Facebook, on Twitter, on various social medias, as well as those who share the show and leave iTunes reviews. That really helps with visibility. And of course, if you aren't able to do those things, you still hit the download button. You're still hanging out to the end of the episode. And for that, I want to thank you so generously for lending me your ear. Hope to talk to you next time here on the Naked Mormonism Podcast. This podcast is produced with the help of Julie Briscoe as social media manager, Brian Ziegenhagen as audio engineer, and Andrew Torres of the law offices of P. Andrew Torres in the Opening Arguments podcast as legal counsel. Music is written and performed by Jason Camo of aloststateofmind.com and used with permission. Naked Mormonism is a production of Ground Gnomes LLC, copyright 2019, all rights reserved.